Okay, and picking up where we left off, right? Like when you have less land to defend, a stronger capital, and are wealthier, right? You could use all of those advantages to create a much stronger military machine, right? And so the army, the navy, and the marines associated with the Byzantine or Empire were, by the end of the Western Roman Empire, far superior to the famous Roman legions. And so what they did was is they took all these advantages and they continued Roman infrastructure like the aqueducts and the big um, entertainment or complexes like the Colosseum and the columns and so much architecture and design, the roads, the Roman roads and the traditions, militarily and kind of politically, and they kept it going. Here is a Byzantine navy ship. You can see this is not a small ship and is a fairly advanced fighting machine. So now let's take a look at how was the Byzantine Empire ruled, right? And for this, we need to acknowledge, number one, that the empire, even at its peak, the Byzantines were much smaller than the Roman Empire at its peak, right? Emperor Justinian, who is the most famous Byzantine Empire Emperor Justinian did attempt to take armies into Western Europe to reconquer Western territory in 6th century, about 100 years after the collapse of Rome, but was not successful. He was actually one of his only failures. He was a very powerful and successful emperor, but the army's move into the West was ran up against the Germanic tribes and the people that had taken down Rome and failed. Now, we do know that the Byzantine Empire put in place political supports and political what do you want to say, constructs that created an elaborate bureaucratic network that supported the emperor. Similar to, you could say, to China, right? They had a professional style government with professional people supporting the government's bureaucracy, right? And this also similar to China, whereas China's civil service academies were tested and trained in Confucianism. The Byzantines actually trained in secular schools with Greek studies, Hellenistic studies, and so they used Greek traditions and Greek education to train government bureaucrats. There's a big overlap here between the Byzantines and China. And this, just like in China, right? If you can go to a school and like through learning rise to get a position in government, making you a powerful, important person, this creates social mobility. We also saw that the Byzantines learned from some of the failures of the Western Roman Empire and tried to distribute some of the emperor's authority out into smaller units. And so rather than the emperor in Rome trying to control this massive territory without without the internet or telephones or anything like that, where it would take literally months to catch word of an invasion or an attack on your far distant frontiers, the Byzantines put in place basically regional governors, similar to the Romans, but empowered them with greater authority. And so generally, these were generals in the Byzantine army whose job it was to control the provinces. Which was the Byzantine Empire's smaller pieces, to control the provinces in the name of the governor. They would raise armies from peasants, local peasants in the areas, and they would basically rule in the name of the emperor back in Constantinople, which meant that it was still a very centralized empire. There was a center to it in Constantinople with the emperor, and then there were people surrounding them, ruling in his name. And this emperor, because there was no separation of church and state like there was in the Catholic Church in the West, because there was no separation of church and state, the Byzantine emperor ruled as God's representative on earth. This has been a cultural construct that we've seen repeatedly since pre-agricultural societies, right, where kings and chiefdoms were all basically there because heaven or gods or the gods chose them to be, and this was invoked by the Byzantine emperor um, to give him an enormous amount of power. And if you are God's representative on earth, you're also then kind of also in charge of the church. They incorporated a lot of stylistic um, things based off of the Persian emperor, right? The massive and court is what you would call the palaces and court life, which is everything that surrounds the emperor on a day-to-day basis. It was grand and massive and blinged to the max, right? Everything was gold and decked out. And this was very much in the Persian style of going over the top with riches and luxuriousness. But at the end of the day, they were kind of boring, right? Like they had all this great look of, you know, over the top, gaudy decoration, but really the empire was focused on profitability, mostly concerned with tax collection and keeping order. Here is kind of a more Greek style of art. You can see the long bodies and the almond-shaped eyes. Mr. Chambers has probably showed you some of this in art class before. You can see the picture on the right is what I mean with that awesome grandeur of court, the large, like, painted ceilings and the gold leaf everywhere and the marble floors, and just like, holy crap, that is rich. Um, so, what brought the Byzantine Empire to an end? We know they ruled for 1,000 years, and so we're really speeding through them and not really covering a lot of the ins and outs of the Byzantines, but what ended them? Now, even though historians might use 330 CE as a start time, or maybe they use after Western Rome fell in 476, um, basically by the 500 years later, the territory of the Byzantine Empire was shrinking, right? Like all empires, they reach a peak and then they start to contract. And so the Byzantine Empire's land began to shrink in 1085 with the rising power of the Muslim empires that surrounded them, specifically the Turks, which had come out of Central Asia, but actually took a big pit stop down in Egypt for a while, and then the Islamic caliphates in the Middle East, and then basically said, "Screw it, we want to be our own empire," and so they moved up north into Anatolia, and they started taking land away from the Byzantines. The Muslim Turks had taken most Asian regions by the late 11th century. Um, we know that independent kingdoms began to form in the Balkan region of in the western part. So in the European side, there was rebellions against the Byzantines, creating independent kingdoms in that region. That is the modern day area that would include Croatia and Bosnia and the Czech Republic. This area back then started rebelling against the Byzantine Empire, and so while they're getting pressure from the Muslims from the east and the south, they're also getting rebellions in the west and the Balkans that is causing weakness. And so all of this meant that by 1260 they were pretty weak, right? They were sick. And so in 1260, we saw a group, and we're going to learn about the Crusades later this week or next week. But Western Europeans called the Pope called a crusade to go back and retake the Holy Land. And then, crazy story, all of these knights marched from Western Europe down with the idea of we're going to get to Jerusalem, we're going to take back Jerusalem, we're going to recapture the Holy Land from the Muslims, and they basically took a pit stop and they camped outside of Constantinople and they said, "Can you let us in? We want to buy supplies from you." And the Byzantine said, "I don't know, right? This looks dangerous, letting you into our city." And they said, "No, no, no, we'll be good. We promise. We just want to spend our money here and support your economy and restock on supplies and food." And so they agreed, opened their gates, and the Crusaders, the Western European Crusaders, said, "Psych," and laid the smackdown on Constantinople, basically sacked it, um, took out an enormous amount of wealth, captured the city, and then left it burning and pillaged after they went home. They didn't even get to the Holy Land. They just basically got the riches of Constantinople and said, "Screw it, Holy Land, we're going home with all this wealth." And so that was a pretty fatal blow to the Byzantines in 1260. By that point, right, their land had been taken by the Muslim Turks in the south and the east. The Balkans, independent kingdoms, had shaken up the west. Now their main city of Constantinople has been like significantly weakened. They did appeal to the Roman Catholic Church as fellow Christians to come and help them against Muslim attacks. Sometimes the Roman Catholic Church said okay, many times they didn't. So in 1453, the Ottoman Turks finally rose up and conquered the previously unconquerable city of Constantinople, other than when you let people in. Um, the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople and the Byzantines were done. This is actually one of the few dates in history that is clean, right? You can literally point to the date that the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople and say, on that date exactly, the Byzantine Empire ended. Here is, you can see the land shrinking. The yellow land was gobbled up on the eastern side by the Turkic empires kind of coming out of Central Asia and the Middle East. And then the lands that are yellow in the west were independent kingdoms rising in the Balkans. So, question we're probably going to end on today is what was the role of Christianity in the Byzantine Empire? And so this is really kind of answered in one word, which is the word is Caesaropapism, which is a combination of two words, right? Caesar and pop or pape. And so the church was closely tied to the state in a way that was not common in Catholicism. The church and the state were intertwined. And this idea of Caesar as pope, the word Caesar means emperor. And so emperor as pope means your emperor and the head of your church is exactly the same person. The Byzantine Empire was the head of both the state and the church. Now, the Byzantines and the Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire did not have a pope, right, or didn't call that person the pope. Instead, that person was known as the patriarch, which is a Latin Greek term, and so the emperor of the Byzantine Empire appointed the patriarch, which was the Orthodox version of the pope. The emperor would appoint the patriarch as the head of the church, thereby establishing that the emperor was above the patriarch. The emperor could fire the patriarch or appoint the patriarch. The emperor did sometimes make decisions on religious issues when it benefited them, and the emperor could call church councils. So, really, what I'm getting at is whereas the Catholic Church in the West was separate from the Western European states, and in many ways even more powerful than kings in the West. It was exactly the inverse, exactly the opposite in the East, where the emperor was more powerful than the head of the Orthodox Church, right? And so in the West, separation of church and state. In the East, in the Byzantine Empire, no separation of church and state, completely connected. Um, and this Orthodox Christianity deeply influenced all of Byzantine life, right? You called on Christianity to validate the power and rule of the Byzantine emperor, who was God's representative on earth. It provided a cultural identity because it was different. It provided a cultural identity to Byzantine life, and we're going to see in later in the next week, right, the influence that the Byzantines had on the formation of a rising like Russian identity, which we haven't talked at all about this year in world history, but we're getting to Russia. And the Byzantines had enormous influence on the creation of a Russian state by basically giving them an orthodox cultural identity. We saw religious icons and buildings everywhere in Byzantine society. Most famous is the Hagia Sophia, which was a famous church that I'll show you on the next slide that I would expect you would recognize because it's a very famous looking building. Here is a picture of the Pope on the left and the Patriarch on the right, which actually kind of looks like a yin and yang idea, right? The black and the white. And if you were to tell me the Patriarch was a Disney villain and the Pope was some good guy, like you would kind of believe that based on this image, but they were not. They were just both heads of Christian churches. And so I'll show you the picture of the Hagia Sophia here in a second, actually. Um, I'll just go through to allow you, because we're going to run out of time here in about 10 seconds. You can pause and get these notes. Pause and get these notes.